The wind wasn't just blowing. It was screaming. It tore across the flat, endless land, hitting the small wooden farmhouse like it wanted to break the boards apart. Inside, Alara pulled her shawl tighter. The fire in the hearth was getting low, and the pile of wood by the door was almost gone. She looked at the empty chair by the fire, the one her husband used to fill, and felt the quiet of the house press down on her. It was just her, the howling storm, and the stubborn old Mare in the barn thought she was just about to brave the weather to get more wood, when a sound cut through the wind. It wasn't the creak of a tree or the rattle of a loose shutter. It was a heavy, solid thump against her front door, once and twice. Hard, like someone was using their whole fist. Her heart jumped into her throat. No one came out here, especially not in a storm like this. Visitors meant trouble or questions she didn't want to answer. She stood frozen, hoping it was just the wind playing tricks. But then it came again, a desperate, urgent pounding that shook the door in its frame. Slowly, her hand trembling a little, she lifted the heavy iron bar from across the door. She didn't open it right away. "Who's there?" She called out, her voice swallowed by the wind. There was no answer, only a low groan from the other side. Gripping the iron fireplace poker, she opened the door just a crack. The man wasn't standing. He was slumped on his knees on her porch, soaked to the bone, his clothes plastered to him like a second skin. He looked up as the light from her house fell on him, and she caught her breath. His face was all sharp angles, skin stretched tight over bone. His eyes were sunken, but in them was a fierce, wild light, like an animal caught in a trap. He was shaking, but not just from the cold. It was the deep shiver of someone who hadn't eaten in days. He tried to speak. His lips were cracked. "Please," he rasped, the word barely a whisper. Then his eyes rolled back, and he started to fall forward. Alara acted without thinking. She dropped the poker and lunged, catching him under his arms. He was heavier than he looked, all hard muscle and bone, and she stumbled under his weight. The storm screamed around them, soaking her dress in seconds. With a grunt of effort, she dragged him across the threshold, his boots leaving trails of mud and water. She got him just inside and shut the door against the raging night, locking the world out. For a long moment, she just sat on the floor beside him, breathing hard. The man lay on her rug, unconscious, water pooling around him. Now, in the light, she could see the details. His hands were rough, scarred. His coat, now ruined with mud, was of a good cut, but worn nearly through at the elbows. And there, under the soaked fabric, was the clear, hard shape of a pistol tucked into his belt. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't some lost farmer or a broken-down traveler. This was a man running from something. The quiet tales she heard in town, whispers of bank jobs and stagecoaches, and a gang of men who vanished into the hills, flashed in her mind. She should be terrified. She should have left him on the porch dot, but as she looked at his face, pale and starved, she saw something else. The desperate fear of a drowning man. She remembered her husband saying years ago, "There's men who do bad things, Alara, but that don't mean there's no good left in 'em to save." She stood up, her decision made. You couldn't let a creature starve, even a dangerous one. She built the fire up until it roared, its heat pushing back the damp chill. She fetched a blanket and wrestled his wet coat off. The pistol she took carefully, setting it high on a shelf, far from his reach. He stirred as she worked, his eyes fluttering open, watching her with that same animal wariness, but too weak to move. She warmed the leftover stew from her own supper, a simple thing of potatoes and carrots and a little meat. When she brought the bowl to him, propping him up against the wall, he looked at it, then at her, as if he couldn't understand the act. Then, with hands that shook, he took it. He didn't gulp it. He ate with a slow, controlled intensity, savoring every bite, his eyes closing for a second as the warmth hit him. It was the way a man eats who knows hunger is an old enemy. He didn't offer his real name. "Jess'll do," he said, his voice still rough. He didn't talk about where he came from or why he was here. Instead, his sharp eyes moved around her small home. They lingered on the empty peg where her husband's coat used to hang, on the single plates set on the table, on the well-ordered shelves that spoke of a life lived alone and careful. He saw her life laid bare in that one room, the hard work, the loneliness, the quiet strength it took to keep going God in turn. She didn't ask. She talked about the farm, about the mare, who was meaner than a hornet, but had a heart of gold, about how the late frost might hurt the winter roots. It was normal talk, safe talk. And as she spoke, the tightness in his shoulders began to ease, just a little. The storm outside began to die, fading to a steady, softer rain. He was a man, not a monster. A hungry, exhausted man who had, for one night, stumbled into a small circle of light and warmth. And she was just a woman who had chosen, against all fear, to open her door. They sat in a silence that wasn't empty, but full of unspoken things, his gratitude, her caution, the strange peace of the moment. The fire crackled, the wind sighed, and for a few hours, the farmhouse at the edge of the world was a shelter for them both. The last of the stew was gone. Jesse sat back against the wall, the empty bowl resting in his hands as if he didn't quite want to let it go. The wild, hunted look in his eyes had softened, replaced by a heavy tiredness. The fire painted moving shadows on his face, making him look both younger and older at the same time. Elara took the bowl from him. Their fingers didn't touch. She moved to the wash basin, the simple, everyday sound of the clinking tin a strange comfort in the quiet. She could feel him watching her, not like he was planning something, but like he was trying to understand a puzzle. "You live out here all by yourself?" His voice was low, less of a rasp now. "I do," she said, not turning around. She scrubbed the bowl clean. "The land needs tending. Someone's got to do it." "It's a hard thing," he said. A statement, not a question. He'd seen the calluses on her hands, the way she moved efficient, with no wasted motion. He'd seen the lone axe by the door, its handle worn smooth. "It is," she agreed. She turned, drying her hands on her apron. "But it's mine. That counts for something." He gave a slow nod, his eyes drifting to the window, where the first gray light of dawn was beginning to bleed through the rain-streaked glass. The storm had passed, leaving a world washed clean and utterly silent. That silence seemed to hurry him. The peace of the night was draining away, and the man on the run was coming back. He pushed himself up, a little unsteady. He gathered his damp coat, shrugged it on. Every movement was careful, deliberate. He stood there for a moment in the middle of her small room, a strange, out-of-place figure. He looked at the shelf where his pistol sat. He didn't ask for it. He just looked at Elara. She understood. She walked over, took the gun down. It was heavier than she expected, cold and solid. She didn't hand it to him. Instead, she placed it on the small table near the door. An offering, not a surrender. He picked it up, checked it with a quick, practiced motion, and tucked it away. The gesture was so natural, it sent a small chill through her. This was his world. Violence was a tool. He stepped to the door but paused, his hand on the latch. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "There are men." He began, then stopped, choosing his words like stepping on stones across a creek. "There are men who would see a place like this, a woman alone, as an opportunity, an easy mark." Elara lifted her chin. "I've managed well enough." "I know you have," he said, and he finally turned to look at her. His gaze was direct, intense. I see it. In the way you keep this place. In the fact you opened that door last night. He shook his head, almost to himself. Most wouldn't have. He looked out the window again, towards the barn, the fields, the tree line in the distance. A man has a right to be safe on his own land, to not be. Bothered. He said the last word with a particular hardness. You've a right to that same peace. It wasn't a goodbye. It felt like a promise. Or a vow. Thank you for the meal, he said, his voice formal now. And for the fire. Then he opened the door. The cool, damp morning air rushed in, smelling of wet earth and pine. He stepped out onto the porch, a dark shape against the lightning sky. He didn't look back. He simply walked, his steps quick and quiet, down the steps and across the muddy yard. He disappeared around the side of the barn, and a minute later she heard the soft, muffled sound of a horse moving off, not at a gallop, but at a steady, distance-eating pace. Elara stood in the open doorway for a long time. The emptiness he left behind felt louder than his presence had. She looked at the rug where he'd lain, the muddy footprints on her floor. Had she been a fool? A terrible, trusting fool? She had fed and sheltered a wanted man. She had seen his gun, knew his trade. The smart thing, the safe thing, would have been to bolt the door and let the storm have him. But as she closed the door and latched it, she didn't feel fear. She felt a strange, settled certainty. She had done what was right, not what was safe. There was a difference. She went about her morning chores. She fed the mare, who nudged her hand looking for an extra apple. She checked the rain barrel, now overflowing. She started pulling the weeds that had sprung up in her vegetable patch overnight. The normal work soothed her nerves. The world was back to its normal, solitary rhythm. But by mid-morning, a prickling feeling began on the back of her neck. The feeling of being watched. It was so strong she stopped, her hands in the dirt, and slowly straightened up. She looked towards the line of trees at the north edge of her property. At first, she saw nothing, just shadows and leaves. Then, a shadow moved. A man on a horse. He was perfectly still, sitting there just inside the tree line, looking not at her, but down the road that led to her farm. Her breath caught. Had Jessie come back? Was this trouble? But no. The shape was wrong. This man was broader, sitting on a bigger horse. As she stared, another movement caught her eye. Further down, near the old fence post, another man. He was leaning against the post, chewing on a long piece of grass, his hat pulled low. And then she saw a third, a younger one, sitting on a rock at the edge of the western field, whittling a stick with a long knife. They weren't approaching. They weren't hiding, not really. They were just there, positioned like sentries, like guards. A cold understanding washed over her, colder than the rain from the night before. This was Jessie's doing. His thank you. His payment. He hadn't just ridden away. He had told his men. And his word, it seemed, was law. She didn't know whether to feel protected or terrified. These were the most dangerous men in the territory. They were wanted posters and whispered warnings. And they were standing silent watch over her turnip patch. She forced herself to bend back to her weeding, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pulled a weed, its roots clumped with dark soil. This changed everything. The debt had been settled in a currency she never asked for. Her quiet farm was now under the protection of outlaws. She wondered what price that protection would finally cost. The sun climbed higher, baking the mud in her yard into a cracked, dusty crust. Elara tried to stick to her routine. She hung the wash on the line. She churned the butter. But her eyes kept being pulled back to the tree line, to the fences, to the rocks. The men didn't move. They were like statues, only coming to life in small, deliberate ways. The one by the north fence would lift a canteen to his lips. The younger one, whittling, would shift his seat. They were ghosts made solid, a quiet army surrounding her world, dot by noon. The fear had hardened into a knot of stubbornness in her chest. This was her home. She couldn't just hide inside, trembling. She filled a wooden bucket with fresh water from the well. Then, taking a deep breath that did little to calm her nerves, she walked. Not towards the house, but towards the north fence. The man there saw her coming. He didn't reach for his gun. He just watched, his face unreadable under the shadow of his hat brim. He was older, his beard streaked with gray, his eyes the color of flint. Up close, she could see the weathered lines of his face, the worn leather of his vest. She stopped a few feet from the fence, the bucket heavy in her hand. "Figured you might be thirsty," she said, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the wide quiet. For a long moment, he just looked at her. Then he gave a single, slow nod. Obliged. He took the dipper she offered, drank deep, and handed it back. His movements were economical, like Jessie's had been. "You plan on staying long?" she asked, trying to sound like she was asking about the weather. "As long as needed," he replied. His voice was a dry rasp, like rocks grinding together. He looked past her, scanning the horizon. "Things have a way of settling. Takes a few days." "What things?" She pushed. He finally looked directly at her. "The kind of things that bother folks who mind their own business." He said it not as a threat, but as a plain fact. "The boss said you've a right to your peace. We're just here to see you get it." The boss. Jessie. So it was true. Her simple act of kindness had been a command to these hardened men. She didn't know what to say. She just took her bucket back. "Name's Thomas," the older man offered, a small concession. He tipped his head towards the young man whittling in the distance. "That's Finn. Don't mind him. He's restless, but he's got a good eye." Alara just nodded and walked back to the house, her mind racing. Thomas, Finn. Names made them real, and that was more frightening somehow. The afternoon brought the first test. A fancy buggy, pulled by a sleek horse, came rattling down the road. Alara knew it, the land agent from town, a man with slicked-back hair and eyes that counted the value of everything they saw. He'd been by before, offering a fair price for her burdensome land, his smile not reaching his eyes. He'd gotten mean when she refused. He pulled up to her gate, his smile already forming. Then he saw Thomas. Thomas hadn't moved from his post by the fence, but he had turned to face the road, his hand resting casually on the butt of his rifle, propped beside him. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The land agent's smile vanished. He looked from Thomas's grim face to the distant figure of Finn, then to the third man, now visible near the barn. His face went pale. He tugged the reins so hard his horse skittered sideways. Without a word, he turned the buggy in a tight, clumsy circle and whipped the horse back the way he came, the buggy bouncing wildly on the ruts. From her window, Alara let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. A problem that had been gnawing at her for months had been solved in 10 silent seconds. Later, she took some biscuits she'd made that morning. She walked them out to Finn. He was young, maybe her husband's age when he'd passed. He had a quick, nervous energy, but his eyes, when he looked at her, were surprisingly gentle. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, taking the biscuit with a grin that made him look like a boy. He ate it in 2 bites. "Quiet out here, ain't it?" "It is," she said. "Usually too quiet." "Better quiet than the other kind," Finn said, his grin fading. He looked out at the land. "Boss told us what you did, giving him shelter. Not many would." He paused, his knife stilling on the stick. "He's a fair man. Hard, but fair. He looks out for his own. I'm not his own, Elara said softly. Finn looked at her, that boyishness gone. You are now. That's how it works. A debt's a debt. As the days wore on, a strange rhythm developed. Elara would do her chores. The men would maintain their silent watch. In the evenings, she started leaving a pot of coffee on the porch bench. One morning, she found a fresh rabbit, already skinned and cleaned, laid neatly on her chopping block. A gift for the biscuits. She began to see them not just as the gang, but as men. Thomas, the steady, quiet leader in Jesse's absence. Finn, the talkative youngster who missed his family somewhere back east. There was a big man with gentle hands who checked her mare's hooves without being asked, and a silent one who fixed the hinge on her barn door that had squeaked for a year. They were outlaws. They had doubtless done terrible things. But on her land they had a single job, protection, and they performed it with a solemn dedication that felt almost sacred. On the third evening, Elara was mending by the fire when a soft knock came at the door. It was Thomas. "Ma'am," he said, hat in his hands. "We'll be moving on at first light." The news hit her with a surprising jolt. She had gotten used to them, to the strange safety of their presence. "Is it settled, then?" she asked, using his word. "Seems to be." He nodded. "Word gets around. This place? It's been marked as under protection. That tends to stick." He shifted on his feet. The boss wanted it seen to. It's been seen to. He turned to go, then stopped. "You did a good thing that night. A brave thing. In our line of work, kindness is rarer than gold. And it's worth a whole lot more." He put his hat back on. "Sleep easy tonight." Elara closed the door, the weight of his words settling on her. They weren't guards anymore. They had become, in their own twisted way, neighbors. And tomorrow, her farm would feel emptier than it ever had before. The silence, she realized, would be the old silence again. But maybe, just maybe, it would be a safer kind of quiet. Elara didn't sleep much that night. The quiet felt different, knowing it would soon be empty again. She lay in bed listening to the old house settle, thinking of the silent men outside. Before dawn, she was up. She stirred the embers in the hearth, added wood, and put the big coffee pot on to boil. She mixed flour and water and fried up flatbread on the griddle, the simple, hearty kind that traveled well. It was the least she could do, as the first pale light touched the eastern sky. She carried the pot and a stack of warm flatbread wrapped in cloth out to the porch. The air was cold and still. For a moment, she saw nothing. Then, shapes detached themselves from the shadows. Thomas materialized by the fence. Finn stepped out from behind the barn. One by one, the others appeared, moving with that same quiet purpose. They gathered near the porch, but not too near, respectful of her space. "Thought you might want something warm in you for the ride," she said, her voice cutting the morning chill. Thomas stepped forward first. "Mighty kind, ma'am." He took a cup of coffee and a piece of the bread. The others followed, each man nodding his thanks, murmuring a quiet, "Obliged," or "Thank you, Mom." They ate and drank quickly, steam rising from their cups in the cool air. There was no loud talk, no joking. This was a group used to moving on. Finn finished his bread and brushed the crumbs from his hands. He glanced at the mare, who was watching them over the barn door. "You take care of that one. She'll take care of you," he said with a small smile. "I will," Elara said. She wanted to say more, to ask where they were going, to tell them to be safe. But the words stuck in her throat. These weren't men who welcomed questions about their future. Thomas drained the last of his coffee and handed the cup back. "The boss's debt is clear," he said, meeting her eyes. "You won't be bothered." "That's a fact." He said it with such finality that she believed him completely. It wasn't a hope. It was a statement of how the world would now be, with a series of low whistles and soft clicks of their tongues. The men brought their horses from the trees where they'd been hidden. They mounted up in one smooth, practiced motion. Thomas tipped his hat to her. Finn gave a last, quick wave. Then, without another word, they turned their horses and rode west, not at a gallop, but at a steady, ground-eating pace. They crested a small rise, silhouetted for a moment against the brightening sky, and then they were gone, swallowed by the land dot. The silence rushed back in. It was immense. Alara stood on her porch for a long time, listening to it. The normal sounds returned, the chirp of a waking bird, the whisper of the breeze in the grass. But they felt small in the vast quiet. She went inside to start her day, but the routine felt hollow. The house was too big. Every little noise made her jump. She found herself looking out the window every few minutes, not in fear, but almost expecting to see a familiar figure by the fence. She saw only the empty land dot around midday. She forced herself to go outside to tend the garden. As she knelt in the dirt, her eyes fell on the porch steps. There, sitting neatly on the top step, was a burlap sack. It hadn't been there when she'd come out. Her heart skipped. Had one of them come back? Cautiously, she walked over. The sack was coarse but clean. She untied the rough twine holding it closed and peered inside. It wasn't money. It wasn't gold. On top was a bundle of carefully wrapped paper packets. Seed packets, tomato, carrot, bean, flowers, 2 morning glories, and sunflowers. Next to them was a new axe head, its steel gleaming and sharp, far finer than her old chipped one. Beneath that was a hefty portion of cured venison, wrapped in waxed cloth. And at the very bottom, something small and smooth. She pulled it out. It was a little wooden dove, carved from pale, honey-colored wood. Its wings were folded against its body, its head tilted slightly. It was simple, but beautifully made, the feathers suggested by careful grooves. It fit perfectly in the palm of her hand, warm from the sun. Tucked beside it was a folded piece of paper. She opened it. The handwriting was careful, the letters formed with a slow, deliberate hand, as if writing was a skill not often used. Asterisk, the debt is paid. The ground is safe. J asterisk, she read it twice, then 3 times. She looked from the note to the seeds, the axe head, the meat, the small dove in her hand. This was his answer. Not with coins that could be stolen or spent, but with things that built a life. Seeds for the future. A tool for work. Food for strength. A small piece of beauty, just because tears pricked her eyes, sudden and hot. It wasn't sadness. It was a feeling too big to name, overwhelming sense of a promise kept in the most honest way possible. He hadn't just protected her from outside trouble. He had given her gifts to strengthen her from within. She carried the sack inside like it was filled with treasure. She placed the seed packets on her table, imagining the colors they would bring. She fit the new axe head to her old handle, testing its perfect balance. She hung the venison in her cold pantry. Last, she placed the little wooden dove on the mantelpiece, right beside the portrait of her husband. It looked like it belonged there. That evening, as she sat by the fire, she felt a peace deeper than any she had known in years. The fear was gone. The loneliness, for now, was held at bay. The men were outlaws. Their lives were violence and dust and running. But on her farm, they had shown a different code. They had shown honor. She knew the stories in town would grow wild. People would whisper about the widow and the outlaws. They would never understand this simple truth. She had offered a man bread and a place by the fire, and in return, he had given her back her world and made it safer. The debt, indeed, was paid. And as she looked at the little dove on her mantle, she knew the protection they had left behind wasn't just in the absence of trouble. It was in the strength they had reminded her she had all along. The ground, for the first time in a long time, truly felt like her own. Time on the farm moved as it always had, with the slow turn of seasons. The deep cold of winter gave way to the soft, muddy thaw of spring. Elara planted the seeds from the burlap sack in neat, hopeful rows behind the house. The little wooden dove watched over the main room from the mantel, a silent guardian. Life returned to its old rhythm, but the rhythm felt different now. The silence was no longer a thing to be filled with worry, but a space for her own thoughts. She worked the land, the new axe head biting cleanly into wood, making her chores easier. The cured venison saw her through the last lean weeks before spring truly arrived. News, of course, drifted in from town on her rare supply trips. She heard the whispers, the widened eyes, when she entered the general store. The story had grown in the telling. Some said a dozen ruthless outlaws had laid siege to her farm for a week. Others swore they'd seen Jesse himself, standing right on her porch, staring down the sheriff's men. The land agent, she heard, had sold up and moved clear out of the territory. People treated her with a new, cautious respect. It wasn't the pitying kindness they'd shown the young widow, nor was it the greedy pressure from men who thought her easy to push. It was something quieter, edged with a little fear. They didn't know what had happened on her lonely farm, but they knew something had. The result was a wide berth, and a peace she had never asked for, but now deeply valued. One afternoon in late spring, she was wrestling with a stubborn, rocky patch of soil, determined to expand her garden. The sun was warm on her back. She didn't hear the approach, only a shadow falling across the ground she was working. Her heart clenched for a single, dizzying second. She looked up, her hand tightening on the handle of her hoedown. It wasn't an outlaw. It was an old trapper, a man named Eli, who sometimes wandered through these parts, trading furs for salt and flour. He was harmless, known for his silence and his knowledge of the deep woods. "Afternoon," he grunted, his eyes sharp under bushy white brows. He wasn't looking at her, but at the tree line, the fences, the lay of the land. "Afternoon, Eli," she said, relaxing her grip. "You're a ways off your usual path." "Am I?" he said, almost to himself. Then his eyes landed on her. They flicked, just for an instant, to the handle of her hoe, to the way she stood, steady and unafraid. "Quiet out here." "It is," she agreed. He nodded slowly, a long considering look on his weathered face. "Good." He shifted the pack on his back. "Heard a thing or two, last time I was up near the Black Hills. Bunch of fellas, riding hard. Got into a spot of trouble with a new gang moving into old territory." Elara's breath caught. She said nothing. The old trapper went on, his voice a dry rustle. "Heard tell their leader, stern fella. He told these new men a story before the lead started flying. Told him about a place, a farm, with a woman who showed kindness for no reason but it being right. Told him that place, and any place like it, was off limits. Said the world needed more quiet corners like that, and any man who disturbed one answered to him. Eli spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. Said it was a matter of honor. Them new boys, they didn't much care for honor. They learned different." He fell silent, the story told. The meaning hung in the air between them, clear as spring water. Jesse was still out there, and he was still enforcing his promise, far beyond the borders of her land. "That's quite a story," Elara said finally, her voice soft. "Ain't a story," Eli said plainly. "It's a fact. Makes a man think." He gave her one last, appraising look. "Your ground is good ground. Peaceful." He tipped his ragged hat. "Keep it that way, ma'am." He turned and walked back the way he came, disappearing into the woods as quietly as he'd arrived. Ilara stood there for a long time, the hoe forgotten in her hands. The sun felt warmer. The bird song sounded sweeter. It wasn't just that the outlaws had left. It was that the idea of them, their twisted code, their stubborn memory of a debt, had spread. Her farm was under a protection that had no walls, no guards, only a reputation carried on the breath of hard men in wild places. That summer, her garden bloomed in a way it never had before. The tomatoes grew fat and red. The morning glories climbed the porch rail, a riot of blue and purple. Sunflowers stood tall like sentinels, their faces following the sun. She would sit on her porch in the evenings, the little wooden dove inside, and feel not loneliness, but a profound connection. She was part of a story now, a story about kindness and its unexpected echo. Years later, when new settlers finally moved into the distant edges of the valley, they heard the tales. They'd come to her, an old woman with steady hands and clear eyes, and ask if the stories were true about the outlaw and the gang that stood guard. She would never give them the details. She'd just look out at her land, at the strong sunflowers and the sturdy fences. "This is good land," she'd say. "It's quiet land. It remembers how to be peaceful." And that was all the answer she would give. The truth was hers, and the doves, and the men who had ridden away. It lived in the safety of the soil, in the unbroken peace of